The lights went out, and that was a really bad sign. There was no noise with the darkness, and that was a really strange sign. I heard urgent footsteps making their way down the hall. Without knowing exactly what it was, I decided to sit on my bunk with my hands on my lap. There was enough moonlight peeking through the high windows to illuminate the area directly in front of my cell. I watched it as the footsteps slowed, then halted right in front of me. C.O. Hensley was staring directly at me. I could barely make out the silhouette of his face, but the shotgun in his hands was extremely clear. COs didn't use weapons unless shit was about to hit the proverbial fan. That meant bad things for people in my situation. And then the cell door began to open. I had nothing to defend myself with. Not that it would matter against a shotgun if I did. The hairs on the back of my neck felt like they were on fire. I turned my face away because the thought of my mom staring down at hamburger meat in the morgue was too much to bear. My dad was an asshole, and you'd have all the evidence you'd ever need if you ever met him. He was fighting with my mom again when the cops showed up. Fighting with isn't really the right term. That implies some sort of equality. I was afraid to move out of the house at age 22 because I was afraid of what my dad might do to my mom. Turns out, so were the neighbors. The cops only knocked once before letting themselves in. I was afraid to step away from the chair where my mom sat long enough to answer the door. They were shouting. Then the cops were involved in the shouting. They tried to move my dad away. He was an asshole about it as usual and ended up in cuffs. They tried to move my mom away. She was scared. She didn't get out of the chair. And there was more shouting. One of the cops pulled the taser and aimed it at my mom. I didn't even think about it. I snatched it out of his hands, threw it across the room, and asked him what in the fuck he was doing. He just stood there, slack-jawed, and said nothing for a while. They found a crack pipe near my dad's wallet. Possession of drugs, paraphernalia, along with a few priors, meant that he'd be going away for some time. They found 1/8 of an ounce of weed in my bedroom. I lived in the same house where my dad's pipe was discovered. Things might have been different if we were rich, or if we had money or something, or if I had a different dad, or if my skin was even lighter. Ultimately, the conclusion was possession of a Schedule I controlled substance, possession of drug paraphernalia, and assaulting a police officer for the taser incident. There were 2 things that I didn't have to worry about after that, though. One was my dad hurt my mom, and the other was 2 to 5 years worth of rent. I'm unarmed, C.O. Hensley, and I'm in full compliance with your instructions. My heart was jittering like a popcorn maker, but it made little difference. If he wanted to shoot me, he would. Afterward, they'd compare the word of a live officer to that of a dead convict, and Hensley didn't need to worry. I didn't even know what was going on. I closed my eyes. Stand up, inmate 1913. He didn't sound like his usual overbearing jackass self. He sounded a little scared. My voice was shaking. I'm standing as requested, sir. I got to my feet with my hands raised. Open your eyes, inmate, he spat at me. I did as instructed. His face was still inscrutable in the shadow. Heads up, he pumped the shotgun with a cold clack. I froze for a fraction of a second before my tight end's reflexes kicked in. The shotgun sailed across the cell and I snatched it out of the air. This made no sense to me. Then C.O. Hensley turned his back to me. You'd better get out of that cell if you want to survive tonight. And with that, he started walking away. All of my survival instincts were at war with each other. Be seen with a gun? That's suicide. Ignore a CO's orders? Not unless I wanted time added to my term. Stay in the cell? I don't know. And that's when the prison shook. Somehow, I knew that whatever was moving it had taken hold from above and was moving the ceiling, the whole ceiling. The prison is the size of a city block. That's when I ran outside of my cell and into the hall. I prepared myself for anything. Had the world gone crazy? Would I see a gunfight? The aftermath of a gunfight? Monsters eating the aftermath of a gunfight? Scenario after horrible scenario slipped through my haunted imagination as I raced across the metal balcony and down onto the main floor. I had never fired a weapon in anger. The shotgun seemed impossibly heavy in this moment, as though it would be more of a burden than a savior. The hair from my scalp to my toes stood on end as I followed where I thought Hensley went. It was dark every step of the way, but I knew it well enough. Shit, I thought as I barked my shin and face planted on the dark floor. Okay, I didn't know it perfectly. I froze as I looked blindly above me. Why did it echo like that when I fell? What was different? I snatched the shotgun from the ground and crept carefully toward the chow hall. That would be the only place big enough for a gathering of people, so I hoped we'd find someone there. I pondered for only a second about what such a gathering would entail before pushing the thought from my mind. I don't want to think in this moment. Nothing made sense, and thinking might drive me crazy. I slowly pushed open the door to the chow hall. Its large bay windows would be more than enough to bathe the room in moonlight. I held my breath and peeked my head inside. Nothing. No living people. No dead people. No sign of a fight. No sign of human habitation. No Hensley. With nothing but silence, my imagination was beginning to take over. And that's a bad thing. The scariest monster imaginable is the one that we can't see, because fear can only exist in the unknown. I crept forward with this thought tap dancing across my brain, creating new mental scars with each step. I walked deep into the room, growing bolder and louder as I went, willing something to find me. Anything was better than not knowing. Hey, I breathed in a loud whisper. Hey, louder this time. And that's when a hand slapped over my mouth. Another grabbed the shotgun and an arm pulled me backward. Everyone knew something was going to happen in the yard that day. There were even bets on how things would turn out. San Ignacio was a small enough prison that only a couple of gangs ran the show. Duke led the only white prison gang, and Reg ran the black one. Do you have any idea how territorial human beings can get over the smallest stretch of land? If not, look into the trench warfare during World War I. It started with some benches in the yard or some stupid-ass shit like that. You see, a bunch of new inmates were coming in all at once. The thing is, this new crop happened to be mostly black, and Reggie knew this. Duke knew this too, and Reggie knew Duke knew this. And when Duke saw Reg talking to the whole new class in the yard on their first day, both of them knew that things were going to change. One way or the other. And every CO knew it too. So when 20 inmates from each gang started mulling around the benches that used to belong to the white gang, the COs were ready. 10 of them marched right between the two factions in a move that surprised everybody watching. Did they want to get killed too? I'd managed to stay out of this for the most part. I'd had to grease a few palms in ways that I'm not proud of, but Reggie had mostly given up on trying to recruit me. I didn't want any part of it, but I definitely was going to watch what was going to happen. How could every CO be willing to risk pissing off both gangs? Well, by not pissing off both gangs, apparently. CO Chully was in charge that day. He was 300 pounds of mean and proud of it. The parade of COs marched behind him, separated the factions, then turned to confront Reg and his guys. Defeated, Reg backed off. The white gang kept the benches, and Duke gave Chully a knowing look as he walked past. I understand why Reggie was pissed after that. Hell, we all were a little bit. Duke's guys were visibly arrogant for weeks. But it was still Reggie's own damn fault when he melted 3 plastic forks into a shank and jumped Chully in the hall. That was stupid. When the COs were done with him, Reggie couldn't walk anymore. He's going to have to serve out the rest of his sentence in a prison hospital. It turns out that some stories just don't have any heroes. Shh. Shut up, the voice hissed into my ear. Do you want them to hear you? I was forced into a crouch and led to the end of the chow hall. I didn't resist. I wanted answers. I was going to follow them wherever they might be found. I was pulled to a group of lunch tables that were barricaded around one corner of the room. The moonlight was just strong enough to make one thing clear about the dozen or so people hiding behind them. They were all afraid. The arm forced me into their midst, bent me into a crouch, and thrust the shotgun back into my chest. Here, Hensley said forcefully. We don't need them taking any more of us. I clenched the gun and looked around at the bizarre sight in front of me. Inmates and guards intermingled, and each one was armed with the weapons that were supposed to be locked up tight in the armory. Everyone looked tense, but there was something completely off about their faces. I realized that they weren't afraid of each other. Of all the differences between prison and the outside, the greatest for me is what people mean to one another. On the outside, they're the people, but in here, they're the opposition. Every person you see wants what you have because they don't have enough of their own. No one is your friend, not really. A friend is something you can only have when you're both free. I looked at the faces, eyes wide in the moonlight, and felt vertigo rush through my head. Shelley was there, knuckles white as he clutched his weapon. Duke was next to him, eyes wide and unblinking. Hensley crouched next to me, nearly nuzzling up to my shoulder. He looked at me intently and placed his finger against his lips. I read once that people tend to doze off under extreme fear. That's the only explanation I can give for being jerked suddenly awake. The group was trying desperately to remain silent as they shuffled around in the darkness. They were failing as several people slammed against the tables and floor. My head swam as I clutched the shotgun tightly and I tried to figure out just what in the blue fuck was happening. Several people were poking their heads just above the benches in panic. I snuck up behind them, heart racing, then looked over the edge in an attempt to understand. I didn't understand. It looked like thick creeping vines were reaching out of the blackness, coiling, writhing, stretching outward towards us as they grew at an impossible rate. Could we even shoot such a thing? There had to be at least 8 tendrils. Were there more? More hidden? I was nearly knocked off my feet by Duke's flailing arms. He was being pinned down by Charlie and 2 other guards. The group fought harshly in the moonlight. Despite the struggle, all of them forced themselves to stay as quiet as possible. I moved toward the wall and pressed myself against it as far as I could go. Next to me, Hensley sat motionless. Charlie and his friends quickly overpowered Duke, who broke the silence with his yelling. No, not me. Not me, he started to shriek. No one else joined either side of the struggle. We just sat and watched. Duke managed to make eye contact with me once he could no longer move. Help me, man. Help me, please. He grunted, then tried and failed the kick. Come on, man. Do you really think they'll spare you next? My blood froze in place at that moment as I looked around. No one wanted to make eye contact with me. I still didn't move as they pulled Duke out from the safety of the benches and into the darkness beyond. I wondered if everyone else would be as silent if, or when, my time came. I didn't really wonder, though. I knew the answer, and I knew I had to watch what happened to Duke. The 3 of them thrust Duke forward. He collapsed onto the ground as his captors scurried back toward the safety of the benches. At first I thought that nothing would happen. I was wrong, of course. The tendrils found Duke and quickly bound themselves to him. He began to scream before one of them stuffed itself deep into his throat, and his voice was instantly cut off. He silently bobbed back and forth as the tentacles pulled him to the ground. Slowly, they slithered back with their prize into darkness. until there was neither sight nor sound left of Duke. The last I saw of him was the look of his bloodshot eyes reflecting the moonlight. Everyone held their collective breath for a moment. This, I realized, was a game of sacrifice. They must have decided while I was sleeping that their only option was to appease whatever was before us. So much for not being afraid of each other. That thought was stuck in my head as I saw a stray tendril reemerge from the darkness. That plan was on my mind as the second one crawled forth and made its way towards us. That knowledge was guiding me as I weighed my options. Don't judge me. I'd do it again in a second. Charlie was the slowest of the group returning to the benches. I raised the shotgun, took aim at his right kneecap, and fired. I don't think anyone realized how silent things had been until the blast went through the darkness. Charlie screamed as I pumped the shotgun and fired at his other knee, but that scream was drowned out by a deep guttural roar as the tendrils descended upon him, binding his arms and broken legs before squeaking with him back into the unknown. But no tentacles invaded his mouth. They let him scream it out this time. And again, it seemed that no one would interfere with the sacrifice. Good. I looked wildly around the room and saw no more tentacles. My plan had worked. That's when Hensley leapt over the benches and charged forward. I didn't think about my reaction this time. I was running before I knew it, with both the gun and the benches dangerously left behind. In another life, I had been a tight end. Clearly, Hensley couldn't say the same about himself. I overtook and tackled him almost instantly. We rolled on the ground before I forced us to a stop, pinning his arms to his sides. The room seemed to shiver in a fever dream. I couldn't see any of the rogue tentacles around me, but I couldn't see much of anything at all. In the darkness, though, I could hear them, chittering around. I bent down over Hensley and whispered harshly into his ear. I just saved your ass, and Shelly just saved all of us. You're welcome. So don't do anything stupid. And I could hear the chittering once more. Things are about to get bad, Hensley, I hissed as I pulled him to his feet. And then the walls began to vibrate. Real bad, I continued. We need to run. He stared up from the ground, looking at me inscrutably. I wanted to smack the shit out of him. What are you doing, CO? Move. He stared back for another second before climbing to his feet and turning away from me, his back toward the tentacled abyss. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back. Get behind the tables, I screamed as quietly as I could. He turned back toward me and grabbed my shoulders, giving me a stare that was somewhere halfway between fear and hope. We'll get past the tables soon enough. I think we can slip through the door to E block while it's eating Chully. So many things about this didn't make sense. CO, that doesn't make any... I got lightheaded with the punch that he landed on the back of my skull. In the eerie calm that came with the bizarre, tingly distance that ensued, I followed him without question. He pulled me forward toward the tentacles, then right through the door towards E block. That section of the prison was separate from the rest. Awareness slowly filtered back in as I found myself running alongside Hensley in the dark. Like the rest of the prison, there was only silence, emptiness, and obscurity. I had no idea where we were going as Hensley led me forward. I finally realized that I should not follow so willingly, that it was time to question this man's motives. And that's when he opened a door and stuffed me into a small room. He followed me inside and quietly closed the door behind us. I was about to tackle him, to strangle him, to demand to know what was going on. And that's when I looked down and realized I still had the shotgun that he had given me. If you're going to shoot me, he interjected as though reading my mind, I'd prefer you do it now and get it over with. He then flipped on a flashlight that he found from seemingly nowhere, casting an unsettling series of shadows across his view. I clearly don't have the balls to do it myself, but if you're not going to oblige, you can stop moving so slowly and help me out. I stared at him, slack-jawed, and that's when he pulled out the book. I looked wildly around and tried to get my bearings. We were in a guard's office, right in the middle of E block. The crazy person's ward. Well, the crazy, extremely dangerous because they're crazy ward. There was a slam as Hensley threw the book on the table. The very strange book that looked like it was covered in skin. I looked at him in revulsion. What do you think you're doing with that? And he stared at me darkly. Don't act like I don't know what that's supposed to be. I did more than just play football when I was at Cal. You think that just because I'm a prison kid that I've never heard of the Necronomicon? He acted like he didn't hear me. We need to find Dor Lish, he explained gravely before turning to walk out of the room. It was dark, but I'm sure I turned whiter than bird shit. I ran forward and slammed the door in front of him. I hadn't been in attendance that day, but based on the number of times the story had been repeated, I might as well have been. They didn't know his name at the time, but detectives from 6 different states had been seeking Dor Lish for 2 years when they finally descended on the house at the end of the road. SWAT had surrounded the residence, and aerial surveillance had been monitoring it for a day before they went in. 30 armed men were called up to capture this prize. The bomb squad had found nothing unusual, so Alpha Team moved right on in the front door. The plan was to meet Bravo at the back, but they never made it that far. Just past the hallway, obscured from any outside windows, was a living room, and in the middle sat Dor Lish. The path to reach him was strewn with human viscera on all sides. The different body parts were indistinguishable in the blended mess. 6 months later, forensics would determine that 37 different people had donated pieces of their corpse to that unholy swamp. Dor Lish did not acknowledge the presence of anyone as they marched in and gagged. He simply continued chewing on what appeared to be angel hair pasta. It dangled down over his heavy bosoms, jiggling as he chewed. Dor Lish did not have a stitch of clothing on his 350-pound frame, which highlighted just how much blood was coating his alabaster skin. It wasn't pasta, of course. It was a bundle of nerves that led down into the spine of the corpse on the ground. The body was face up, with the nerves snaking through a gaping cavity in the man's torso. The man was missing every part of his face from his forehead down to his chin. Instead, a bloody casserole was punctuated only by shiny, white teeth, where a mouth once had been. Dor Lish refused multiple commands to surrender. Instead, he stared hungrily into the men who had come to arrest him as he continued to chew. That's when the corpse revealed that it was, in fact, not a corpse. The man reached a feeble hand up to his own temple, pointing to it with a thumb in the air. The horrified police realized that he was begging them for a death that he'd been previously denied, and wanted nothing more than his own brains splattered against the wall. The police never did admit to which one of them mercifully obliged, and that's how E-Block came to house Dor Lish. Since then, 3 9-fingered guards had asked for a transfer since his arrival at the prison. Hensley looked up at me, sizing me up. I don't know why you need my help right now, Hensley, but it's time to start talking. I spat at him, and he nodded. Okay. I was caught off guard by this. Let's sit and chat and I'll tell you everything. Conversely, we should not waste what little time is left with an explanation you won't believe anyways. The choice is yours, though. As if on cue, the roof shook again, and this time it sounded like it was tearing away. The walls trembled and the dust tumbled down in the dark. The image of the terrified guards and prisoners flashed through my mind. The rest of them are probably dead by now, because they're weak. They live longer than anyone else because they're weak. It's true. But that just made it want to play with them more. Are you weak, inmate? This CO, he was always an asshole. My mind was officially frazzled now, and that's how I found myself following Hensley through the dark. We had to go through an extra security door just to gain access to the control panel that would allow entry past the other security door so that we could stand in front of his cell. With each barrier, I grew a progressively stronger feeling that I'd have been safer with the tentacles. When Hensley finally opened up the triple padlock door, it groaned in protest. I had a feeling that it didn't get opened much. There was a light coming from inside. I peeked around the edge of the door and saw that it was coming from a small fire on the floor. At the back of the room stood Dor Lish. Most of his body was clad in a black robe. Enough of his face was showing, however, to reveal that he'd been unable to remove the mask forcibly placed upon him by the guards. It was the same mask worn by Hannibal Lecter. That mask, combined with his dark hood, created a chilling effect from the obese man. Hensley exuded terror, but held his ground. He gripped his own shotgun, finger on the trigger. Dor Lish didn't acknowledge our presence. Instead, he growled. The growl developed into words, and those words became a chant. My blood turned to ice. For the life of me, I could not understand why I didn't just wait to die with the rest of them behind the tables. Lish yelled to the ceiling. My blood turned to ice. For the briefest, stupidest moment, I actually believed that nothing would happen. Maybe it would all be okay. But it was not all okay. There was a sound so loud that I actually felt it into the sky. I dropped to my knees and let the gun fall to the floor, wrapping my arms around my head in a fruitless attempt to block out the noise. When it ended, I wondered if I had gone deaf. The ringing in my ears disproved that soon enough, though. My mind was foggy as Hensley pulled me to my feet. He was shouting something, and his voice tuned in and out of my head. Look up, inmate. Listen. I was only able to pick a few words out of the ringing, but I heard enough to look up. When we were in elementary school, Mrs. Dunwich taught a lesson on Impressionist art. She showed the class a picture of Van Gogh's Starry Night and nearly teared up. When the class asked her why, she said it was because the way that God must see the world. Our feeble attempts to build mighty structures were nothing compared to the magnitude of the heavens, which to God were nothing more than a single brushstroke. The great mystery the universe offers is not life but size, and this one painting shows just how small we truly are. I was a speck of sand as I watched the shadow lean over the now roofless prison. The shadow occupied the space of an expansive storm cloud but moved as a living being. It was darker than the night sky around it, but the outline was more than enough, more than too much. The creature's wingspan reached from end to end of the building, spreading out of sight. Writhing tentacles the size of tree trunks dangled from its face, which was punctuated only by two glowing red eyes. I said, "Don't look up, inmate. Are you stupid?" Hensley screamed as he grabbed my shoulders and forced my face down. Dor Lish was yelling his chant at the now open sky, seemingly unaware of our presence. The fire at his feet, though small, was burning brighter, as though angry. I didn't know how badly I was trembling until I tripped over my own words. What? What is that? It sounded clear in my head. Don't ask me, Hensley growled as he shoved a flask between my lips. I drank half a gulp and sputtered. And don't spit that out either, he shouted. Here he took a swig of his own before shoving the flask into his coat pocket and then tucking the Necronomicon under his arm. That's Kentucky grain alcohol there, son. Here he pumped his shotgun and looked over at Dor Lish. We'll wish we had more before long. I was panting now. I had so many questions. But they would have to wait. A sick, slick, licking sound emerged from our left, drowning out even the horrible chants of Dor Lish. Though something told me that the emergence of the sound was connected to his words. Despite everything, the being that emerged to our left was clearly the most immediate threat. It stood 8 feet tall, with rigid segmented sides like a bug's thorax. Dozens of stalks emerged from its top, swaying gently like seagrass in a warm current. On the edge of each stalk was a snapping mouth, opening and closing, lazily waving a thick black tongue. It slid forward on a bed of writhing, slimy tentacles that reached out and pulled forward. They were seconds away from wrapping around our feet. I had no time to react. Hensley slammed the Necronomicon into my hands. Read it, college boy, he screamed. I thought for just a second, and then decided to not think at all. I squatted so that the book would be visible in the firelight. Looking down at the page he had left open for me, I struggled to understand what I was reading. Hensley, this isn't even in English." "Time is a factor, inmate," he spat back. Would you ever consider screaming profanity into a quiet library? I felt that same sensation of wrongness as I spoke the impossible letter arrangements on the page before me. I heard a slorch as the thing in front of us paused with one tentacle about to wrap around Hensley's heel. Slack-jawed, I looked up at the creature. And that's when I saw the other tentacle. It had slipped quietly around my back and was just about to brush up against my neck. It had me completely entwined. It was temporarily frozen, but as soon as I stopped speaking, the tip of the tentacle gave a little jiggle. It was just so eager to tickle my throat. I looked down and resumed reading, faster now. I didn't stop as I listened to Hensley's staccato footsteps move past the tentacle and approach the creature. The sound of the shotgun blast shook the hallway. The frozen tentacle rippled past my head, brushing my cheek, leaving a thick coat of globby slime to drip past my collar and trickle down my back. 2 more shotgun blasts were overrun by the sound of the creature's inhuman screaming. It sounded like Hensley was torturing a vacuum cleaner with a bag of angry pigs. One final shotgun roar ended the screaming for good, and in the relative silence that followed, the vile chanting of Dor Lish again came to dominate the room. I placed the Necronomicon gently on the floor. I think it gave my fingers a gentle squeeze as I laid it to rest, and then I picked up the shotgun I had dropped earlier and aimed it at Lish's head. Hensley grabbed the barrel of the gun and pointed it forcefully downwards. "You stupid moron. Don't you think I'd have killed him already if that was possible?" His words sounded angry, but when he looked at me, white knuckles still in the barrel, his face showed nothing but raw fear. He is the channel between the worlds right now. Imagine 100 linked train cars going over a fork in the track. If you try to change from the left track to the right one halfway through, the whole train is screwed and everybody dies. He then looked over at Dor Lish, who still seemed unaware of our presence as he wailed, hands high in the air. "Wherever we're going, inmate, it's together. All of us." At that moment, we heard a groan come from down above. We both reflexively looked upward. Descending from the inky sky was, impossibly, a man being lowered on a rope. Though bound hand and foot, he was otherwise naked. The man was audibly sobbing as he slowly approached solid ground. Hensley went white. "Oh God," he whispered. "It's the warden. Lish is going to feed him to it." Here, Hensley actually started to cry, and that scared me more than anything yet. "Once it's eaten," Hensley croaked, "we'll all be able to pull to the other side." He looked at me with woeful eyes. "I hope you still have shells in that shotgun, inmate. You'd better put that barrel in your mouth." Hand shaking, eyes and nose flowing, Hensley put the barrel of his own gun under his chin. He pulled the trigger, and it made a soft click. He wailed, pulled another shell from his pocket, and quickly loaded the shotgun. To be clear, this guy was a jerk. There were plenty of times I would have volunteered to blow his head off and laugh as it happened, but that didn't stop me from grabbing his gun and pulling it firmly away from him. Hensley collapsed on the ground, inconsolable. I dropped his shotgun to the floor, holding my own weapon in my right hand and the book in my left. I looked up at the impossible sight in the sky. The naked warden now dangled 15 feet above the floor. The way that he sobbed so unabashedly was even stranger than the incessant chanting floating from Dor Lish. Imagine that you came home from school one day as a young child to find your parents collapsed on the floor, wailing and sobbing. Imagine they just didn't care that you saw them in such a state. Picture just how badly your own worldview would be turned on its head. The warden had always been the general of the invading army. And things happened when and because he said they did. Now as he descended toward the earth, even the drool that slid from his lips seemed to be beyond his control. San Ignacio State Penitentiary was a shithole. About that, no argument could be made. But stand in one place long enough, and it becomes your home. My corner of the yard was in the warm sun each morning, and evolved into a cool patch of shade every afternoon. I would go, sit, and close my eyes, and for a few brief moments of every day, I would be free. You know, it's funny. I never thought about how free I wasn't until they put me in jail. The species likes its bars because the confines make it safe. The scariest thing about prison is that the bars are no longer visible. I was sitting in my corner with my eyes closed, being free, when the nastiest of the prison gangs decided that my peace wasn't worth their time. "Why don't you stand up and say hi?" I could hear the nasty smile in his voice. I opened my eyes and rose nervously. Co.Ag was speaking. Co. Hensley and another guard were standing beside him, chuckling uncontrollably. The reason for their giggles was more than obvious. Charlie didn't even bother to hide the joint in his mouth. "Tell me, inmate," Charlie said slowly, "have you got some nachos you're hiding for us?" Co. Hensley burst a loud guffaw at this. "Oh no, my mistake," Co.Ag continued, grinning maniacally. "You're all about that fried chicken, aren't you, son?" My face and neck burned as Co. Hensley doubled over in laughter, and I saw red. The change in their behavior was difficult to describe, but it was immediate. They didn't slouch and were trying hard to subdue their laughter. Co.Ag plucked the joint from his mouth and pinched it out between his fingers. They were looking over my shoulder at the man approaching in quick, crisp steps. His fitted suit contrasted sharply with the uniform that Co.Ag was wearing. "Hello, warden," Co.Ag offered when the man stopped next to us. "Chully, I need to know that you're not wasting my time and money," the warden said darkly, looking Co. Hensley up and down. "You said that coming to the yard would be worth that aforementioned time. Now show me." "Yes, sir," he said sharply. "I wanted to show you what we were doing to address the contraband issue." Here, he lifted the now dormant joint. Inmate 1913 was hiding something under the fence there. It's why he's always scurrying into that corner. He's using it as a drop spot for our problem. He finished gravely. I was dumbfounded by this. A million different retorts spun through my head. I looked for one that would get me in less trouble than remaining silent, but found none. The warden looked at me like I was a wild, errant raccoon. "Why haven't you removed him yet?" he asked, his voice dripping with disgust. "We cannot hope to rehabilitate the rest while the worst offenders spoil their efforts." Most of my mind was boiling with rage now. The rest of it was weighing just how many years I'd be willing to add to my sentence for a single right cross into Charlie's fat jaw. My head was still spinning when Charlie and Hensley each grabbed one of my upper arms and started forcing me off the yard. "And Charlie," the warden snapped suddenly. Charlie then stopped and turned to face the man, dragging me forcefully with him. The warden looked at us each thoroughly in turn. He seemed bothered by something. Finally, he nodded once to himself. "Be sure that you're looking out for my nephew. I can rely on you for that, right?" "Yes, Warden Hensley, of course, sir." The warden nodded once more and turned around. He and his crisp suit marched quickly off the yard and out of sight. The warden shook in his bonds, thinning gray hair flopping uncontrollably as he cried. He jiggled pathetically, and I turned away in disgust. "I'm sorry," Hensley cried from the floor. "I'm so sorry, sir." "We need to cut him free when he gets to the ground," I responded urgently. "You can't, you moron," Hensley gurgled through his sobs. "What do you think is pulling him in?" I looked up at the rope that suspended him. It disappeared into the pitch-black sky above. Yet something about the way he descended made it apparent that a force was pulling him into Dor Lish, and that the desire of gravity was just a coincidental afterthought. "He's connected to Lish," Hensley continued in a shaky voice. "We can't touch him, or we're going to be a part of it too. All we can do is watch." A low, grumbling roar emanated from above, causing the walls and floors to tremble. It sounded triumphant. I shook my head slowly. We can't interfere directly with Lish, or we'll mess everything up around us. Yet if we do nothing, then whatever is watching over us right now gets to eat your uncle, and we'll get pulled over to the other side." Another powerful roar from above came. He was getting restless now. Hensley cradled his knees in his arms, rocking slowly back and forth. "But if I touch the warden, I'm bound to his fate. Am I right?" And Hensley confirmed this with his silence. "You know what I learned that day on the yard, Hensley? The one with the marijuana and the joints and all that?" He looked at me with something that almost might be called regret. It was a lesson that stuck with me. I then pumped the shotgun once. It made a satisfying cha-chink. There's no peace in this place. All you can do is find your home in this chaos. I then aimed the gun high above Dor Lish. The warden met my eyes and screamed, No, this isn't how I wanted things to end. There's so many people I love." I blasted him once, and his head exploded like a dropped watermelon. His arms and legs continued to twitch without purpose. That part, at least, was normal. But the tear was not. The point in space where his head had ripped apart was also shredded, as though someone had torn a piece right out of a page. Hensley looked up, and Dor Lish looked up, and the creature from above wailed in fury. The tear continued to spread, inching out in all directions like cracking ice. The scope of the tear ignored the magnitude of perspective, reaching across my field of vision at a constant rate regardless of background size. The tear reached Dor Lish first. It extinguished his fire with a hiss, then caught him by the ankle. The 350-pound cloaked masked monstrosity let out a single gasp and was sucked into the white oblivion. I looked down at Hensley, who met my gaze with an eerie calm. The tear was reaching out for him. We both knew that running would do no good. He never turned his eyes away from me in the last moments. He simply said, "Elsewhere," and then he was gone. The tears came for me next, of course. There was no one else to take. I imagined for a moment that I would heroically fight them off until the final moment, defying the will of the greater world, with a resistance that would be overcome only by death. But it didn't happen. It came for me, and I simply stood, waiting until the tendrils held my arms and plunged me into the white nothing. I didn't remember falling, or landing, or waking up. I remember just being here. I don't know when it started. It's 2024, not 2014 like it was when all of this happened. You know that feeling when a person is standing too close behind you, making the hairs on your neck prickle? I get that feeling all around me. I know when specific people are near or far because I feel them long before I can see or hear their presence. That's how I know that Hensley exists somewhere in this place, though I have no idea exactly where. I am certain that Dor Lish is alive, and he's somewhere much closer. But worst of all is that thing. It's not just nearby. It's part of this place, the way a reader holding a book has a whole universe in the palm of his hand. For the moment, it's slumbering, but it's so angry. And at this time, I have no idea what to do when it wakes up.